Okay, I'll just jump in the interest of time and not preventing people from getting to lunch. Um, so I'm a bit late to the party, but I decided to fall in with the other lecturers and go along with David's presentation of career path, at least up until this point. So I'm Canadian. I went to university at McGill, which is in Montreal. I studied physics and mathematics. I didn't bother with a picture of the hideous building that I spent most of my time in. And that was quite theoretical and not really to my taste. By the time 4 years was over, I was looking to do something more applied. That's kind of been a common theme. And so I next went as a master's student to the University of Alberta, which is in Edmonton, so quite different from the part of Canada that I'm from. And I was looking for an applied project, and I ended up studying atmospheric science and working on turbulent boundary layers near the ground, basically, and had a very glamorous experience of spending 8 weeks on a dairy farm applying this to methane emissions from cows. I was lucky at U of A at that time. There was one lonely oceanographer. It's in the middle of the country, so quite a distance from the ocean. And he was teaching the fluid dynamics class that I had to take that year as an atmospheric scientist. And so that's when I decided I would switch and think about oceanography. So I went as a PhD student to Dalhousie, which is on the east coast of Canada in Halifax. And there I was supposed to work in the North Atlantic with mooring observations. And very early after my arrival at Dalhousie, my supervisor was unable to attend a planning meeting for what was the International Polar Year at that time, a big Canadian project which was going to freeze an icebreaker into the Arctic for for a year and fly science teams in and out every 6 weeks. So I went along, and I wasn't supposed to involve myself, but it sounded too good to miss, so I convinced my advisor to let me do both projects and spent a lot of time working in the Canadian Arctic. And then I was looking for a postdoc, and I had two choices, one in Alaska and one at the University of Tasmania. And so my husband and I decided to move to Australia, even though neither of us had ever been there. So went to Hobart and spent 3 years working there, and in the meantime, my husband got a permanent job. And so I went to my mentors at that time saying, what can I do to try and get a position in Australia? And their advice to me was, the easiest way for us to argue not to lose you would be if you came with another offer. So go and find a job somewhere else, and then we'll be able to argue that we shouldn't let you go. So I did that, and I applied for jobs, and I secured a tenure track position at William & Mary at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, and I went back with my offer to my colleagues in Australia, and they said, that sounds like a really good opportunity, you should take that job. So I did, and I moved myself and my husband at that time to the east coast of the United States, where we had our two sons. But after 4 years, the same people who had advised me to go find another job, one of them decided to retire, and so I was lured back to Tasmania to take the position of my former mentor. And I now happily live in Hobart and have no plans to do any more overseas moves anytime soon. But I guess I would just reiterate what the others have said. It's a pretty messy trajectory when I think back on it, but I think I ended up doing the thing that I'm well suited to in a place that I like to live, so that feels like a win overall. And sorry about my voice, I'm losing it, so I'm doing my best, and hopefully it'll hang on till the end. Okay, so I don't maybe I have to point it here, that's why. Hopefully this isn't too uncomfortable, provocative, contentious, but I am going to talk about climate solutions, but I'll first go back to what I said I would talk about yesterday, which is anthropogenic perturbations to the Southern Ocean carbon cycle. So I'm aware that this one is also preaching to the choir here, but I thought I might just quickly go through it in case it helps you to prepare for any lectures that you might have to give going on about to explain to people the importance of understanding the climate system. So the figure on the left-hand side is a time series of CO2 observations, quite a famous one, atmospheric CO2 from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. That's the red line going up, up, up since the 1950s to the present day. And then jumping over here, I know we have one paleo person, and probably lots of people have seen this before, but so this is the present day over here now and going back in time. And I show this just to remind you of how unprecedented in the recent geological past this increase in atmospheric CO2 is. So over many hundreds of thousands of years, we had quite regular oscillations between about 200 and about 300 parts per million. And in our very short time, in the last 200-300 years, we have rapidly increased. The concentrations are now well over 400 ppm. And so the ocean, of course, responds to this, and we know with very high certainty, because we know about the ocean chemistry, that adding CO2 to the atmosphere, because those two things talk to each other, means that the CO2 goes into the surface of the ocean, and there's a corresponding decrease in pH, which is shown by the blue line here. So another thing that's really nicely demonstrated by this time series is that the variability, seasonal or interannual variability in the ocean is of course larger than it is in the atmosphere, but the trend in time is very clear, right? So there's a decline in pH that is directly the result of the increase of anthropogenic CO2 in the atmosphere. And that is what ocean acidification is. So this is another opportunity with a captive audience to clarify that there are lots of processes that cause pH to change in the ocean. Ocean acidification was really a term that was coined to deal with the input of anthropogenic carbon into the ocean and the associated change in pH. So just the fact that phytoplankton respire and create CO2 and a decrease in pH is not ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is really the result of this extra CO2 that's coming into the surface of the ocean. It's an important, potentially semantic only, I guess, but I feel important distinction. Oh, I keep pointing at the wrong thing, sorry. All right, so we have plenty of observations by now from all around the world, not just in Hawaii, that show that these surface declines in pH are ubiquitous over the ocean, and that's a figure from the IPCC. And as I explained yesterday, this is not only a surface signal now, but this anthropogenic CO2 change and subsequent change in pH, which Sarah also showed, has penetrated into the ocean interior. So some of you have seen this, I guess, if you've heard me talk about this stuff before, but I found this paper not that long ago, and I thought it was great. So accumulation of fossil fuel in the atmosphere and in the sea. So this comes from way back in the 1970s. And the text in the box there, I'll read it. Quantitative predictions of the accumulation of fossil fuel CO2 have important implications for marine life. So no big surprise that that should be the case. And yet, over the last, let's say, 2 decades, there has been an enormous amount of research dedicated to understanding what the implications on marine life of changing the pH would be. Keep doing it, sorry. Okay, so one of the ways in which we have thought about changes in pH and their impacts on the organisms that are sensitive to that is via this parameter called the calcium carbonate saturation state. So it's a chemical determination. It's shown there, so it's defined by the equation at the top. Oh no, it's not defined by the equation at the top, sorry, but it relates the formation of calcium carbonate. So basically, if you think about chemistry, you can form minerals if the situation is suitable to do so, and if the situation is not suitable to do so, you might favor dissolution. So it's about whether there's a supersaturated environment or an undersaturated environment for this particular mineral. And when values of omega are above 1, that would mean, chemically speaking, that the waters are supersaturated. So that might mean that it's easier for organisms to build skeletons and shells out of calcium carbonate. I would point out that at the threshold of 1, it doesn't explain what really happens in the ocean. So shallow water coral reefs, for example, require thresholds of much higher than 1. They need values of about 4 to be able to, with good energetics, be able to grow. And if the values of omega are below 1, then that indicates undersaturation, which means, chemically speaking, that calcium carbonate can dissolve. It does not mean that organisms who build their shells out of calcium carbonate are unable to live, but it does mean that it costs them more energy to be able to build the mineral than it would if they were living in supersaturated conditions. And so as CO2 in the ocean goes up and pH goes down, the carbonate saturation state also goes down. So it becomes more difficult for organisms that need to do this construction of calcium carbonate, which, just to link it to what I said yesterday, that's the particulate inorganic carbon, that's PIC. So this includes things like coccolithophores, pteropods, and lots of other animals that are part of, this is a very simplified, so Sarah, I apologize, terrible food web, but this can have implications for the things that are pictured at the bottom there, coccolithophore, pteropod, sea snail, and also Antarctic krill has been shown to be quite sensitive to both pH and saturation state. And as we now know, because we saw a bit about this yesterday, these are so-called keystone species, right? If something goes wrong with Antarctic krill, then that has real implications for the rest of the Antarctic food web. And these interactions are complex. It's certainly not as easy as decrease the pH and everything falls apart, but it is something that we need to work hard to understand. Oops, sorry. Okay, so yeah, so I did want to just come back to this figure just for a little moment, and similar to, I think, Dirk, you explained at the beginning, when things go into IPCC reports, there's a requirement to put a label of low, medium, or high confidence on that, and that generally comes from substantiating what you're saying with other peer-reviewed literature. So many of these processes are shown as having medium or even low confidence, but I would suggest that that doesn't necessarily reflect the opinions of most scientists about whether the impacts are likely to be positive or negative, but rather the certainty that we have to, suit what needs to go into assessments like the IPCC. And so ocean warming and acidification, I might just quickly say those, in terms of feedbacks, those would work together, right? So when you warm the water, you also lower the pH. So even without the additional CO2, you can have implications that are pH related for organisms in ocean warming. And so if you do both, and then potentially also draw down oxygen, or they have less oxygen, these things all work in a way that is probably bad news for a lot of the critters. Not everyone, some things might benefit from these conditions, but in general, I think the idea is that there will be negative implications for the Antarctic food web. Okay. So this is a reminder of what I talked about yesterday. So think about the ocean sink for anthropogenic CO2 to be largely controlled by the physical drivers, but the vertical gradients in the ocean to be controlled by the biological carbon pump. I would not say that it's simple to predict what the feedbacks for the physical system are, but it is particularly complex to understand the feedbacks to the biological system. So, I keep doing it, sorry. So we have some general thoughts that if you increase the temperature in the ocean, you might decrease mixing, and that might limit nutrient supply. So that might be something that inhibits biological productivity. On the other hand, if you limit mixing, you might relieve light limitations, so that might be positive for organisms attempting to grow in the upper ocean. The next one is about metabolic rates. So I think the general consensus is that if you increase temperature, you increase the metabolic rates of organisms living in the ocean, thinking in particular about bacteria and phytoplankton. But it's very unclear whether this favors a net increase in primary productivity or whether this favors a net increase in respiration. And so that has implications for how much organic material leaves the surface of the ocean and finds its way to the interior. And the last one is about a shift towards smaller phytoplankton with warming temperatures. So that has been shown with some empirical evidence. And that has real impacts for the efficiency of the biological carbon pump. So we have this idea that smaller phytoplankton clump together but don't form large aggregates that promote sinking. And so if we shift the community away from larger organisms like diatoms towards maybe more numerous but smaller organisms, it might actually result in less organic carbon finding its way to the ocean interior, which has implications for atmospheric CO2. Okay, and this one, I'm sorry, because I wanted to show a figure, but I struggled to find one that I would be able to explain well. But this is a relatively recent paper, which is going to give me a nice segue into what I'll talk about next, which is about overshoots, so temperature overshoots. So we have this idea that we're committed to not letting the global mean temperatures rise beyond 1.5 degrees. It's probably not going to happen. Let's say it's 2 degrees. These were some simulations, so similar to CMIP, but they're called CDR-MIP, CDR standing for carbon dioxide removal, so then Model Intercomparison Project. And this is a bunch of different simulations that were run to try and test what would happen in the ocean with a temperature overshoot. So supposing that we do not meet our 1.5 degree target. And what they concluded was that there is, of course, warming and decreased oxygen, which drives in the ocean an irreversible loss in the volume of ocean in the upper 1,000 meters, where you have conditions that are good for marine life. And the irreversible loss means that even if we correct after the overshoot and we manage to get the CO2 out of the atmosphere and get the global mean temperatures back down, this does not change. The oxygen loss and the habitat volume loss is a persistent feature even after the overshoot is corrected. So this is a model. This is not necessarily representative of what will happen, but I think it does point to some of both the complexities in the system going forward and how the ocean and the stuff that lives in the ocean is not only thinking about temperature and concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, I showed this yesterday, so still scary today. Okay, so I'm going to jump a little bit now. I would like to put a disclaimer on the next bit to say that I'm not advocating for any of this, but I thought with you here it would be a good opportunity to talk about some of the things that are rapidly getting funding and attention in certainly the US, Europe, and also Australia, and that's about carbon dioxide removal. So this too is from the IPCC special report on limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the figure's a little bit small and a little bit hard to interpret, but let me walk you through it. So basically the gray is emissions. So So this one, all the areas under the curve here are the fossil fuel emissions over time. So this is emissions and this is time. And the gray stuff is attributable to fossil fuels. The yellow is bioenergy, so like biofuels, and also carbon capture, so carbon capture and storage, so big dirty industries managing to capture some of the CO2 emissions before they go into the atmosphere. And sorry, that sounded really biased, big dirty industries, but anyway. And this and this one is agriculture and forestry, so that's assuming that we change land management, basically, so reforest and change agricultural practices. And so but the point here is that these are just a handful of the scenarios that were chosen, of the pathways forward that were chosen, but in all of them, there's a requirement to go below this zero line. So in all pathways where we manage to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to do negative carbon dioxide removal. So it is insufficient for all the scenarios run by the IPCC to simply stop emissions. We now have left it to the point where we need net removal as well. And that's not my opinion. That's, I think, quite an established certainty by now. Okay, so that's the segue into would we use the ocean for this? So this is what I'm going to talk about now, which is so-called MCDR, ocean CDR, marine CDR, pick whichever term you like, which is using the ocean to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which it already does, right? I talked about that yesterday, and that's something that we're all familiar with. The ocean is one of the most important reservoirs for inorganic carbon, and it does already take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And I should also probably say here that if we did nothing, we limited, let's say we all stopped burning fossil fuels now today, and then we did nothing. At some point in the very distant future, about 80 to 90% of those emissions would end up in the ocean. That's the closure term for the slow global carbon cycle, right? That is where it will end up. So these proposed solutions, if you like that term, are about accelerating the natural redelivery of atmospheric CO2 into the ocean. And so why would you do this? Well, the ocean is the largest reservoir of carbon on the planet. I showed the figure yesterday with the global carbon budget. It has several orders of magnitude more inorganic carbon already in it than any of the other reservoirs. And that's also shown by the figure that looks like a blue donut there. I like the second point, restoring atmospheric CO2 to 280, so pre-industrial concentrations, requires moving 270 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere. So this is what's already in the ocean. This is how much we're talking about to restore the atmosphere to pre-industrial concentrations. That represents less than 1% of the current global ocean inventory. So it's not a lot. That doesn't mean it's a good idea, but it's not a lot compared to what's already there. Yes? So it's just a, yep. No, not every year, but that, yep. No, but that's a good point. So, sorry, I'll go back. So what that means is that, yes, in a sort of from today to tomorrow sense, if we wanted the atmospheric CO2 to go back down to pre-industrial, this is how much that we need to remove. But yes, it's important to probably emphasize many more times that none of this is independent of decreasing emissions. None of these things are possible without limiting emissions severely. Yeah, thank you. Okay. All right, so these are just schematically showing the options, basically. I wouldn't say agreed upon options, but the ones that are out there for ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. So you have, I won't go through them all, but you have electrochemical ocean carbon dioxide removal, so I probably won't talk about this one too much, but I'm happy to offline. You have deep sea storage, enhanced alkalinity. These ones are probably a little wackier, artificial upwelling and downwelling, macroalgae, so kelp basically, cultivation, microalgae, so smaller phytoplankton cultivation, and restoring blue carbon. So this one, I would say, probably doesn't belong with the others because the timescales for which you can store carbon and blue carbon reservoirs are insufficient for these things. So I think there is some consensus now that the net removal stuff has to have some permanence, and the way that's been kind of loosely defined is hundreds to thousands of years, and blue carbon reservoirs are just too quickly turned over to meet that permanence test. So just by way of separating these things, they're basically, the way that I like to think about it is they're all about enhancing the storage of carbon in the ocean, and you can do that by enhancing the biotic or the biological carbon pump, or you can do that by enhancing the abiotic, so the way that carbon gets into the ocean through physical processes. All right, so this one, so big kelp, is macroalgae cultivation, so this is about enhancing the biological carbon pump using kelp farming, basically. So these are probably too many complicated figures, but the general premise is seaweed farms. So you would go somewhere out into the open ocean and you would grow lots of seaweed, and that seaweed is like a big POC, so it would strip nutrients and inorganic carbon out of the surface of the ocean, which would allow additional CO2 to come in, presumably. But the big thing with this one is that once you have that biomass, you have to put it somewhere. And the proposals vary, but many of them involve taking that biomass and putting it in the deep ocean, where over time it will be returned back to inorganic carbon, but away from re-exchange with the atmosphere. So I was going to ask, does anyone see any issues with this one? But I'll just tell you what I see as a really big problem with this one is, of course, that sounds great, right? You grow seaweed and it takes up inorganic carbon, but it also needs lots of nutrients. And then if you take that biomass and you stuff it away somewhere, you have effectively stolen those nutrients from being used by other members of the ecosystem, including fisheries and many of the places that these are being proposed, which are important to economies that depend on that and food for humans. So I don't have really good feelings about this one. Yep, that's probably all I want to say about that. Yeah. Yes. That's okay. You choose a place where there are nutrients, and so you strip them out of the ocean. So I guess that's what I wanted to say. There is quite a lot of effort now being put into identifying strains of kelp and potentially even engineering strains of kelp so that they use relatively more carbon than nitrogen. But even that, you cannot escape the fact that the nutrients that you use to grow this cannot be used to grow something else. Yeah. Yes. A lot. A lot, yeah, a lot. I will come a little bit back to the idea of what's scalable potentially and what isn't. I think most of the recent movement on macroalgae cultivation has shifted to being about using materials, so using the products of the sequestration, so growing kelp for other uses, whether it's to eat or to make things out of, rather than just stuffing it somewhere where you wait for it to be remineralized. But it would be hard to grow enough seaweed to, you can't do the whole job that way. Yeah. Okay. This is just really quick, and probably only to touch on the subtlety as to why one of them is biotic and one of them is abiotic. So starting with the abiotic one, it's artificial downwelling. So that's about just like what it sounds. That's like that's about taking the waters that are currently at the surface of the ocean and pushing them down somewhere else. And the goal with that being that with that pushing downward, you transport also the inorganic carbon and nutrients and everything else that's in those waters. And so the idea is a little bit related to what I showed yesterday about the mixed layer pump, is that it's supposed to accelerate the delivery of particulate carbon into the ocean interior. It's problematic for lots of ways, not least of which I don't think you could do this at scale, but that's considered a physical process, so enhancing the physical pumping of organic material into the ocean. And then the other one, artificial upwelling, is considered a biotic process, so that's about bringing nutrient-rich and also carbon-rich, but that's about bringing nutrient-rich waters towards the surface of the ocean to enhance biological productivity, which, if it subsequently sinks deeply enough, could potentially store more CO2 in the ocean interior. I see that you're making a face like this is crazy, Andrew, and I agree with you. These ones, these ones do seem to be particularly wacky to me. But I will also say that I have been approached by Australian industry about artificial upwelling. So just leave that there. Yes. So, so I haven't included the indications of, I think they call it technical readiness. So I think these ones are still really sort of on the fringe of having been evaluated for real world application. So they are not technically ready. So I don't think that anyone has really done enough research to know about scaling these ones up. I could be wrong about that. And there is some work being done in Europe about artificial upwelling and downwelling. Okay, this one is the one that probably has the most relevance to what I talked about yesterday and to the Southern Ocean more generally. So this is about iron fertilization. I've put iron or other nutrient, but it tends to very quickly focus on iron fertilization, which has a history in the science of having been done. So this goes back to Martin saying, you know, I can put a shipping container full of iron in the ocean and give you another ice age. So this has to do with the understanding that we have, which is that there are large areas of the modern ocean that are underutilizing nutrients because the phytoplankton is iron limited. So if you give them extra iron, you produce extra particulate organic carbon, which if you manage to sink too deep enough in the ocean, you potentially can change the atmospheric CO2 concentration. And indeed, this is what we think had a significant contribution to the oscillation in CO2 between glacial and interglacial periods. So there has been a fair bit of research done on this over the last many years. So these figures come from a review paper by the Koreans who are looking to spin up additional iron fertilization experiments. And the map shows the the numbered circles show the places where artificial iron fertilization experiments have been conducted. And the black triangles show natural fertilization. So places like Kerguelen, places where we know you get sedimentary supply of iron seasonally naturally, and those have been used as analogs for iron fertilization for some decades. And so this figure shows they're numbered, so they correspond to the numbers here. So where 1 and 2, equatorial Pacific, there have been quite a few done in the Southern Ocean, given that it has that high nutrient, low chlorophyll status, a couple in the North Pacific and a couple in the North Atlantic. And this shows the patch size. So this is the patch of ocean that was fertilized with artificial iron. This one shows the change in primary productivity that was attributed to having added that iron to the surface of the ocean. This one shows the change in PCO2 at the surface of the ocean attributed to that extra primary productivity, and it's colored by the change in dissolved inorganic carbon. So this is just by way of summarizing the experiments that have already been done. Mostly, they're pretty small scale, mostly compared to what's being discussed now. Something that they all have in common is there was never a really credible demonstration that there was any increase in the export of particulate organic carbon to the ocean interior. I think that's, I don't think anyone would disagree with that statement. So, yep. Kind of, yeah. Yep, so you would bring a source of, it has to be somehow bioavailable iron, but I think of it more as sprinkling, not pumping, but yes. It is supplied from, probably is mixed in tanks on board a ship and supplied to the surface of the ocean. Some of the experiments used tracers, so they were able to follow the patch of fertilized waters. I think the very early ones did not. And yep, that's it. And then they watch, and they have some satellite imagery and increasingly more sophisticated techniques to see whether there is actually a stimulation of phytoplankton productivity in direct response to that fertilization.
Is there any kind of negative impact on that that can be expected, or does it have any impact on any other organisms?
I think there probably are quite a lot of negative impacts. There may be some positive ones also. I think probably, well, I would say that all of these things come with ecological implications that have not been well understood. Yeah. So, and I guess with the iron fertilization in particular, the idea is to stimulate blooms of diatoms, which are big and heavy and sink quickly. But you have the same issue of you're not adding nitrogen or phosphorus or silicate, so you're potentially stripping those nutrients from communities that might have used them in a different way. Yeah. So I think, yep, there's a lot that we don't know. This is recent work by a colleague, Leonard and Veronica, which I think lots of you know. And this was a kind of an effort to constrain locations where maybe this could work in the Southern Ocean, and then provide a spatially resolved cost analysis. So looking at this from the perspective of, are there places where we would do it that would meet certain criteria, like not stripping nutrients that should be used somewhere else, or not having unintended consequences on the ecosystem. And so they did, I would say they did a relatively sophisticated look at this. So these are places based on observations where we know that iron is non-limiting, it's gray, is mildly limiting, it's blue, or limiting, it's red. So that was a kind of first step, right? You wouldn't go somewhere and do this in a place where the phytoplankton community was not already limited by iron, because if you did that, there would be no point in giving them the extra nutrients. At this one, I don't really have time to talk about it, but I'd be happy to offline. At the moment, all of this is illegal for most countries who have signed something that's called the London Convention, London Protocol. I would note one notable exception to that is the United States, who did not sign that. Is that what your question was about? No. And so these are the various treaties and international boundaries and EEZs that are relevant to the Southern Ocean. Yes?
Won't most of this immediate growth just get expired?
I think so. I think so, and I think that's why most of the experiments that have been done so far have failed to show a significant export. Yep. But this has a renewed focus, and so you can go to this website and see that there are plenty of really smart people, I would say, who feel that this deserves more research. And I think the community is a little bit split over whether this deserves more research because it's something that we ought to do, or whether this deserves more research so that we can convince people who might go ahead and do it anyway that it's maybe not the best idea. Yeah. And oh yeah, so these are, it shows prior, so OIF stands for ocean iron fertilization, natural is the red, and then possible new sites. And I will say that if you go to this website and have a look, they have some suggested sizes of what the experiment should be, the durations, and the location. So it has somehow managed to pick up a lot of steam over the last, say, 5 years. Okay, this is the one that I'm probably most familiar with. This is ocean alkalinity enhancement, and similarly, there's been a lot of movement on this lately, and so this is a new publication. I can't remember how many chapters are in there, but it's a series of papers which are intended to be a guide to best practices for research into ocean alkalinity enhancement. So I probably won't talk about that one too much, but the idea here is about adding alkalinity to the ocean, and if you do that, you shift the carbonate chemistry such that the PCO2 goes down. And if the PCO2 goes down, that means that you have concentrations in the ocean that are now less than those in the atmosphere, and you induce an additional uptake from the atmosphere. So this is still about enhancing the ocean carbon cycle, but it does not necessarily involve biological processes. That, of course, depends on the source of alkalinity that you use. So just going through this one schematically from over here. So at the moment, we have a situation where the ocean and the atmosphere are basically in equilibrium, so CO2 is the same on both sides of the water here. You do an addition of alkalinity, and I won't go into it now, but if you have questions about how and why this works, I'd be happy to talk about it. The addition of alkalinity shifts the carbonate chemistry in the ocean such that you now have a decreased PCO2. You also have an elevated pH. And because of that, now disequilibrium, you have an ingassing. So CO2 comes into the ocean, and this is the important part. Very rapidly, it dissociates into something called bicarbonate, which is really stable and has a long life, hundreds of thousands of years residence time in the ocean. And after about a year, the air-sea equilibrium is restored, depending on where you are. So it can take longer in some locations and less time in some locations. So importantly, I think this is analogous to the way that the long or slow geological cycling of carbon in the ocean works, where you have the input of alkalinity from weathering of rocks on land via rivers, places, calcium carbonate cliffs in Dover, if you've seen those white cliffs. So you have the input of alkaline materials into the ocean, which allows the ocean to take up more CO2. So that is part of the natural cycle. This is supposed to be analogous to that natural cycle, but a way of accelerating it. There we go. Yeah, no, these are all really good questions. And so some effort has been put into scaling these things up. I'm not ready to answer that in terms of this many kilograms of crushed rock or this much treated seawater. But this one, I would say, has some potential to make an appreciable difference in the atmospheric CO2 concentrations if it was done at scale. Now, you might now ask, what does at scale mean? That means something like converting all current wastewater and desal plants to also add alkaline materials to the ocean. So it is large volumes of seawater, but it's potentially one of the ones that could be scaled up the most easily with existing infrastructure, potentially. And I guess, and I don't know how many of you were at the Ocean Sciences meeting last year, but there are a lot of things that are really going ahead rapidly with this. So this is just, this is a relatively old example now, which took place in Florida. Yes, and so that's a dirhodamine, that's a red tracer that often gets applied at the same time as the alkalinity so that you can trace the patch of seawater. And this one, where they say ACE is its field test, they were able to show that PCO2 did indeed come into the ocean from the atmosphere, and that there was a temporary relief of acidification. So all that really means to me is that alkalinity went in, which increased the pH, right? But it's temporary, because the goal of the thing is to decrease the PCO2 so that you can push more PCO2 in, which ultimately decreases the pH again. These are my colleagues, actually, that I went to graduate school with, who have started a company called Planetary, which is in cooperation with Dalhousie University, and they're doing a similar experiment, but at a pretty large scale, actually, with a wastewater treatment plant in the Halifax Harbor. So it's happening, and it's also attracting a lot of money. So this is just the ones that I could find quickly, but the US in particular has thrown a lot of money, and I'd probably ask you, raise your hand if you know someone who has left a job in science to participate in this, and probably everybody does, right? Yep. So this has attracted a lot of people, good people, which I think maybe is ultimately a good thing, and is being pitched, I think, as a potential solution for getting CO2 out of the atmosphere using the ocean. Yes. Everyone has their hand up. Sorry. Yeah. JB.
Would you need to, like, are there like regions where they could, like, applying that there are some other like regions that can be downwelling, or can that be applied wherever that is happening?
So that's probably one of the beautiful things about this one in particular, is that you can apply it anywhere. So you will get the most efficacy from it if you apply it somewhere where a full re-equilibration with the atmosphere can take place before those waters leave the surface, so that you get the CO2 in the short term. So you might think then doing it in a downwelling area would not be such a good idea. I would say, because we're dealing with a problem that is going to be around on the time scale of fully circulating the ocean, thousands of years, even if it did end up in a downwelling area, that is likely to inhibit outgassing somewhere else. So it really doesn't matter where you do it. It will have the same impact. Yeah. Yes.
That's my understanding, but maybe I'm wrong. So is it fair to say that the cost of all these solutions are orders of magnitudes larger than the cost of mitigation?
Um,
And if you do the math, I've seen some calculations that the net mitigation is
so what do you mean by mitigation?
mitigation, well, just the reducing emissions.
So we have to do both. I think that's important. So reducing emissions will cost those. Do these things have prices? So hundreds of dollars per ton of CO2 sequestered, things like that. I couldn't easily speak to the difference in order of magnitude between the two, but the prices are coming down, and many of these methods rely on the price of electricity, actually. And so getting that to come rapidly down through the use of renewables might help that quickly. There's also been lots of investment already. I can't remember if it's millions or billions, but the US has backed a massive expansion in direct air capture. So it's a totally different thing. It doesn't involve the ocean, but I think at the moment today, you're right, they are still quite expensive. Yep. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Is this somewhat related to enhanced weathering with the?
It's the same.
Yeah, but it's like with the drops.
Yep. Yep. So yeah. So the reason that I didn't specifically talk about that. So you can get a source of alkalinity from a few different places, right? So the probably the most the most abundant one is of course limestone, right? That's one of the most abundant minerals on Earth. That's calcium carbonate. There's also silicate weathering could be used. Opal is insoluble at the surface of the ocean, but there are projects that are using fine grains of opal into green beaches on Hawaii and mixing those into beaches with the hope of olivine, sorry, not opal, olivine with getting that to dissolve. So you have lots of choices for your source of alkalinity. It a bit comes back to Jibé's question. If you also include the cost of mining that stuff and crushing that stuff and delivering that stuff to the ocean, you need to also pick a place where it can dissolve. So that relates back to what I was talking about earlier. The saturation state for calcium carbonate is supersaturated almost everywhere in the global ocean surface. So putting limestone at the surface of the ocean isn't your best bet because it just won't dissolve. So it won't do the job as effectively as some other techniques, that's where it comes to electrochemistry. So I think all of the things that I've pictured here are talking about splitting seawater. So you take seawater and you split it into sodium hydroxide and hydrochloric acid, and you reintroduce the sodium hydroxide into the sea. You may well ask, what do I then do with large volumes of hydrochloric acid? And I think that remains a question. Yes. Yes.
You mentioned there were some consequences on the pH of the ocean.
Yep, so when you add alkalinity to the ocean, you elevate the pH. So it's a temporary relief of ocean acidification. You can think of it as the opposite process.
And when you put CO2, when you put CO2 in the ocean, you decrease the pH. Is it neutral then in the end, or do you have a decrease or increase in the pH?
So that would depend on how much alkalinity you add. Yep. So have been some thoughts about choosing locations to do this that are particularly already having adverse impacts of low pH. So there have been some experiments in the Australian Great Barrier Reef, for example, which might be a suitable place to add alkalinity. It would have maybe the extra benefit of relieving ocean acidification temporarily, and as the waters move and take up CO2 elsewhere, that's possibly something that could be thought of. But ultimately, you're right. The goal is always to get the CO2 that's currently in the atmosphere into the surface of the ocean, which over the longer-ish timescale will acidify. Right? It will result in pH decline.
But there's all this method of storing carbon in the ocean, like on an ocean acidification point of view. In the end, is it a way to solve the atmospheric problem, but is it displacing it into the ocean by enhancing this ocean acidification problem, or?
I think it depends on the places and the timescale. Yeah, so that's a hard question. Yeah. Yes. In So I think the alkalinity enhancement, the impacts of it are very much dependent on what material you choose to use to change the alkalinity. So if you add calcium carbonate, for example, I think there are a host of not well understood interactions with the carbonate cycle, which of course includes phytoplankton and other animals, which is why if it were me, I wouldn't choose that one. But yeah, yes.
If you link to that, what you mentioned, if you grind down limestone and you put it on the surface of the ocean, there's a factor of turbidity, and the light won't be able to reach.
Yes, that's true. It also won't dissolve, right? So there is the Frotch thing to do, I think, for many reasons, but yep.
This is not one of the proposed solutions, then, I hope.
Oh, adding limestone? Oh, it definitely is, yeah. Okay, so this is more about, I think, what's relevant to those of us who are not jumping to some startup company, but about what can the science do to either help to convince people not to do these things or to help us all to feel comfortable about moving forward. So research and development needs for this, which comes back to things that I talked about earlier and also Sarah did. We have to be able to monitor and measure the ocean to a point where we understand what's happening in the natural system and can actually assess these perturbations, whether they're deliberate or otherwise, right? We also need life cycle analysis. So a couple of people have asked me questions that I'm not able to answer because I'm not an economist, but there is a need to make sure that these things are scalable and permanent and cost something that someone would potentially be willing to pay. Mapping and planning, I don't know really what to say about that, and modeling. So this is an example of a model that shows the fraction of CO2 retention, so what remains in the ocean 100 years after the response of a surface bloom. And so you see as fraction, so where it's dark red, that means most of the CO2 is still there. When you get into the yellow and colors, you're looking at only 0.2 or maybe 0.3. So this is about how difficult it is to ensure that phytoplankton, for example, this is in response to a surface bloom. So you stimulate phytoplankton, they take up CO2 because they make it into organic carbon. Some of that organic carbon sinks and is respired back to CO2. This is about how difficult it is to ensure that that additional CO2 remains at a depth where it is no longer susceptible to re-exchange with the atmosphere. And it's not a simple thing to do. There are very few locations where it's a sure bet, I would say, especially if what you're talking about is retention for more than 100 years, which I think has loosely now been agreed upon as the kind of threshold for whether these things are permanent. Yes. Did you have a question? Oh, yes, Hannah. No, it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't. But I guess 100 years, you can think of 100 years a bit like a hybrid car. It's not great if we all go out and buy hybrid cars because they still require fuel, but it's definitely better than us all going out and buying diesel cars. So I think the 100-year time frame is intended to be a time scale over which we have time to come up with different and better methods, but also a threshold for some reasonable thing to start with. It's pretty hard to think about geological storage that exceeds hundreds of years. I think I might have a slide in the next one. Oh, and then, sorry, this one is just about the platforms that we have that might actually help us to measure the things that we need to measure in the ocean. And that's not sufficient, I don't think, at this stage, particularly not in the Southern Ocean. So this comes a little bit to your question, Hannah. This is about assessing the sequestration time scales of ocean-based carbon. Okay, so CDR. So this is about injection, actually. So how much carbon remains sequestered as a fraction of time, or as a function, sorry, that's a typo, as a function of time after injection. So this is 2 sites. These are famously long time series sites, Station P in the subarctic North Pacific and the Bermuda Atlantic time series in the North Atlantic, well, sort of North Atlantic. And so you can see that they have quite a different response, right? So the sequestration times are pretty much decades to centuries, except for when you manage to get the carbon all the way into the ocean abyss. And so thinking back to the biological carbon pump is very infrequently that we actually get the carbon into the abyss, right? A kind of good rule of thumb, which I said to somebody yesterday, is about 1% of the particulate organic carbon that's produced at the surface of the ocean ever makes its way down to the very deep sea. So getting carbon all the way there, if you're relying on enhancing biological productivity, is a really tricky thing to do. And the panels on the top there show the existence of our current array of observations. If you focus now on PCO2, so that's SOCAT, that's a surface ocean carbon atlas. It shows the number of months. So if it's blue, that's 12 months. That means we have full annual coverage of observations. And as the colors get lighter, you see that there are many, many areas of the Southern Ocean where we have insufficient observations even to characterize the seasonal cycle. With ships, so I should say that SOCAT is ship-based data. The one in the middle is GLODAP, so that's dissolved inorganic carbon, so those are full-depth transects where we have measured things like inorganic carbon and total alkalinity in the ocean. The colors aren't showing up very well, but it's few, right? Those cruises tend to happen in summer, so we don't have seasonal resolution with them. And the third one is modified from that same paper I showed yesterday by Alison Gray. That's about BGC Argo, so this is the array of floats. There's a huge effort led by the US and contributed to by other nations to get profiling floats into the Southern Ocean. I do want to emphasize that BGC Argo measures pH. It does not measure PCO2. It does not provide a measure of alkalinity, and there's a lot between measuring pH and getting to PCO2. The map at the bottom, which is from Bronte Tilbrook, shows a kind of different view of the array of observations that we have. This is from the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network, and so that shows things like moorings, fixed time series, GoShip, which is the same as the GLODAP section effectively, and volunteer observing systems. And so I would say that In the Southern Ocean in particular, we do not have sufficient observations to characterize the seasonal cycle in lots of different locations, and I would argue that we certainly don't have the observations that would be required to assess a perturbation in something like alkalinity, a deliberate one or a natural one. I think we just are not there yet. Okay, well, this is, yeah, I'll just leave this here. This is my last slide. So this is about the Southern Ocean time series. So this shows one of the longest records at a fixed place that we do have in the Southern Ocean. So this is a recent paper I did with all of the data from the SOTS mooring, and it goes from about 2011 until 2021. So the top panel is PCO2 there compared to some model products, and the bottom panel is the upper ocean, so the upper 500 meters of temperature, and you can see the mixed layer depth overlain in black there. And so this is one initiative. It's not the only one. It's maybe not even the best one. But I think as a community, what's required is additional observations. You can have opinions about whether you think this stuff is a good idea or not. I certainly have opinions about it. But I would note that it is happening in some places with quite a lot of momentum. So it'd be, it's maybe a topic for conversation over coffee or something. But that's it. Thanks.